There are people who live their entire lives without ever having to think about their heartbeat. But for Nwankwo Kanu, every beat in his chest feels like a reminder of how close death once stood to him. While millions see a man always smiling in the stadium, no one knows there are nights when Kanu lies awake in the dark just to make sure his heart is still working. There are moments when he places his hand on his chest in the middle of the night, breathing slowly in fear as his heart suddenly beats stronger than usual. After open-heart surgery in his 20s, his life was no longer the life of a normal soccer player. It was the life of a man who had to learn how to live with the obsession that his body could betray him at any moment. But the most painful thing was not the illness. The most painful thing was that Kanu was not allowed to let anyone see that fear. Nigeria needed him to be strong. His family needed him to keep standing firm. The fans needed to see the familiar smile on his face. So for nearly 30 years, Kanu lived two different lives. One life in public with calmness, gentleness, and those smooth runs on the grass, and another life in silence, where he fought against the fear of death without being able to share it with anyone. But it was precisely this man who lived with that fear, who wrote one of the greatest careers in the history of African soccer. But Kanu won the UEFA Champions League with AFC Ajax in 1995 when he was just in his early 20s, becoming part of the golden generation that shook Europe. He helped the Nigeria national football team win Olympic gold in 1996 after defeating Brazil and Argentina, creating the greatest miracle in the history of African soccer. In the colors of Arsenal F.C., Kanu became a beloved legend for his elegance and moments of genius, especially that unbelievable hat-trick against Chelsea in 1999. He won the Premier League, the FA Cup, and was a member of the unbeaten Invincibles team in the 2003-2004 season under Arsene Wenger. Kanu was named African Player of the Year twice, appeared in multiple World Cups, and became a symbol for an entire continent. But his greatest legacy is not in the trophies. It lies in the fact that a man who once heard doctors say his heart could stop beating at any moment, still kept getting up, kept fighting, and kept giving hope to millions of others around the world. Before continuing the painful journey behind Nwankwo Kanu's smile, please hit like and leave a heart as a token of gratitude for the man who survived the fear without ever letting the world see him fall. And if you want to continue accompanying true stories of resilience, loss, and legends who paid with their entire lives to keep standing strong, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this journey. Before Nwankwo Kanu became a symbol of African soccer, before the whole world cheered his name in the giant stadiums of London or Atlanta, he was just a skinny boy growing up amid the red dust and poverty of Nigeria in the years when life was sometimes so fragile that a full meal also became a luxury. In Owerri, in the 1970s, poverty was not a temporary situation but like a layer of dust covering everything. It lay on the old roofs, on the sun-baked dirt roads, on the faded clothes of the children, and even in the tired eyes of the adults trying to live through another day. Power outages were normal. There were nights when the whole neighborhood sank into thick darkness, with only the sound of insects rising in the stifling air and the sighs of adults after a long day without earning enough money to buy food. In Kanu's crowded family home, everything was always lacking sleeping space, lacking food, lacking money, and sometimes lacking hope itself. His mother almost never truly rested. She woke up before dawn, did every kind of work to feed her children, then at night sat quietly praying in the flickering light of an oil lamp as if stopping the prayers would make this life collapse completely. Faith filled that house so strongly that the children grew up with hymns and prayers more than laughter. But even God could not make the poverty disappear from their lives. Kanu grew up surrounded by such things. He never had a childhood like other children. No toys, no trips far away, no feeling of carefreeness. From a very young age, he understood what the pressure of having to survive was like. He saw his mother exhausted after long days, saw the men in the neighborhood return with desperate eyes because they could not earn enough to feed their families, saw children grow up and then disappear into poverty as if they had never existed. And amid all of that, soccer became the only place where his heart felt lighter. Those scorching afternoons under the African sun, Kanu and the other kids in the neighborhood played barefoot soccer on ground so hard that the soles of their feet bled. The old ball rolled through the red dust, through rare laughter and echoing shouts in the poor neighborhood. No soccer cleats, no beautiful grass field, no coach, but for Kanu, that was the only time he could forget the feeling of helplessness covering his family. Every time he ran after the ball, he felt as if he had escaped that confined life for a moment. But even in those rare moments, Kanu's body still quietly carried a secret no one knew. He often got tired faster than the other kids, After a few long games, he had to sit down and catch his breath while the others were still running and jumping. There were times when his heart beat so hard that it scared even him. There were nights when the boy Kanu lay on his simple bed, placing his hand on his chest just to feel his heartbeat racing inside his body. But in a place where people did not even have enough money to buy cold medicine, no one thought about taking a child to get his heart checked just because he often felt tired. And Kanu also learned to stay silent very early. He did not want his mother to worry more. He did not want to become a burden in a family that was already too exhausted. So he continued playing soccer, continued running under the burning sun, continued pretending he was fine even though sometimes the tight pain in his chest made him secretly bend down to breathe. Gradually, soccer was no longer just a game. It became the only path out of poverty. Kanu began to understand that if he wanted to save his family, to stop his mother from crying silently every night, to give his younger siblings a different future, he had to succeed at all costs. There were evenings when he sat in front of the small house, looking at the darkness covering the poor neighborhood, and told himself that his life could not end here. But the most heartbreaking thing was that even when he was still a boy holding the dream of changing his family's life, inside his body there already existed a weak heart that could destroy everything at any moment without anyone knowing. But then time passed, and the skinny boy who once ran barefoot on the red dust roads of Owerri began to attract attention in a completely different way. Nwankwo Kanu was taller than the kids his age, and those once awkward long legs gradually became a strange advantage that made him move on the soccer field as if his body did not belong to the ground. In local games, people began to stop and watch that boy touch the ball. No one understood why a child who grew up in poverty could play soccer so smoothly. He was not the strongest, not the fastest, but every time the ball touched Kanu's foot, everything around him seemed to slow down, and for the first time in his life, that boy made the adults around him see something like hope. News of his talent gradually spread through the poor neighborhoods, then to the youth teams in Nigeria. People began to say that Kanu could go abroad one day, could earn money, could change his life, and from that moment, his childhood almost ended completely. His family began to look at him differently. So did his relatives. In their eyes, Kanu was no longer just a child. He became the only opportunity for the whole family to escape the life that was crushing them every day. In Nigeria at that time, if a child in the family played professional soccer or went abroad, the entire extended family would almost live depending on that person. Kanu was not yet mature enough to fully understand the weight of that, but he felt it through everyone's eyes every time they mentioned his future. Phrases like "you must succeed," "you are our hope," "don't waste the talent God has given," began to appear more and more, and a boy who just wanted to play soccer to forget poverty now began to carry on his shoulders the responsibility of saving his entire family from despair. The first trips away from home also began from there. Kanu left Owerri to join youth teams and play in many different places in Nigeria. That should have been the most exciting time for a poor boy, but for Kanu, it was full of loneliness. He missed home so much that there were nights he could not sleep. The cramped dormitories, the long, dusty and noisy bus rides, the meager meals, and the feeling of being lost among strangers made him often sit silently for hours just thinking about his mother and siblings at home. But he was not allowed to go back, because every time he returned, the hopeful eyes of his family made him understand that he had to keep going no matter how lonely it was. Also during those years, Kanu's body began to send more frightening signals. It was no longer just fatigue after playing soccer. There were nights he woke up startled because his heart was beating abnormally hard in his chest. There were times he had to sit up in the middle of the night to breathe because the feeling of tightness in his chest would not go away. But he had never told that to anyone. In Kanu's mind, there was only one fear. If people knew his body had a problem, everything would end. No more soccer, no more future, no more chance to save his family. So he chose silence. He continued training as if nothing was happening, continued running under the hot sun until exhausted, continued smiling when people talked about the great future waiting for him ahead. But deep inside, Kanu began to live with a strange feeling that even he could not name. It was the feeling that his life had never truly belonged to himself. From very early on, he had to live for his family, for the expectations, for the people who placed all their hopes on his feet. Every goal he scored was no longer just his own victory. It was food money for the family. It was school money for his siblings. It was the dream of changing life for the whole clan. And as time went on, Kanu understood more and more that if he fell, many people would fall with him. That was exactly what made him continue walking in silence, carrying both the fear in his chest and the weight of expectations far greater than his still very young age. Then one day, the dream that his whole family had clung to for many years finally appeared. Nwankwo Kanu left Nigeria for Europe to join AFC Ajax when he was still very young. For people living in the poor neighborhoods of Owerri, that was almost a miracle. A boy who once played barefoot soccer on scorching hot ground was now about to step into one of the most famous soccer academies in the world. Everyone in the family cried with happiness. They believed life would finally change. They believed Kanu had escaped the poverty that had trapped the whole family for many years. But no one knew that from the moment the plane landed in the Netherlands, that boy began to step into a completely different kind of loneliness. Europe was much colder than he had ever imagined. It was not just the cold of the weather, it was also the cold of strangeness, of the feeling of not belonging here. The first days in Amsterdam left Kanu almost overwhelmed. The gray skies, the biting winds cutting through his skin, and the silence of the city made him miss Nigeria until he could hardly breathe. He grew up in the noisy sounds of crowded neighborhoods, in the smell of red dust and the intense heat of Africa. Now he lived in a completely unfamiliar environment, where people spoke a language he did not understand, ate foods he had never seen, and looked at him with curious and suspicious eyes. In the eyes of many Europeans at that time, young players from Africa were often seen as poor boys who only knew how to run and use physical strength. Kanu felt that very clearly. He heard mocking words about his voice, saw contemptuous looks when people knew he came from Nigeria, and understood that he had to try many times harder just to be seen as a normal person. There were days after training when Kanu sat alone silently in his dorm room for hours without talking to anyone. Nights were the worst time. He often called Nigeria with the little money he had just to hear his mother's and siblings' voices, but every call ended leaving him feeling more pain. There were nights when Kanu sat alone by the window of the cold room, listening to the rain hitting the glass, then cried silently because he missed home so much he could not bear it. He missed the heat in Owerri. He missed the sound of children on the street. He missed the smell of his mother's cooking. He missed the feeling of belonging somewhere, but he was not allowed to go back, because now the whole family was placing all their hopes on him. Kanu understood that he had to survive here at any cost, and then soccer once again saved him from that lost feeling. On Ajax's training field, Kanu began to amaze everyone. That tall, skinny frame that seemed awkward actually possessed rare soft technique. He touched the ball like an artist, moving differently from the African strikers Europe had known. Gradually, the suspicious eyes began to turn into amazement. Kanu became part of Ajax's golden generation alongside the most talented young players in Europe. And when AFC Ajax won the UEFA Champions League in 1995, the poor boy who once played barefoot soccer in Nigeria suddenly became a European champion. The whole world began to mention his name. Fans in Nigeria stayed up all night to follow Ajax's matches. Kanu's family felt for the first time that the hope they had placed in him was truly becoming reality. But while his career began to take off, his body sent more and more frightening signals. The fatigue appeared more often after each match. There were training sessions when Kanu felt his chest hurt so much he could hardly breathe but still forced himself to keep running because he did not want anyone to notice anything unusual. There were nights he woke up in his sleep because his heart was beating irregularly in his chest, and no matter how much the fear grew, he still chose silence. He feared that if he spoke out, everything would disappear, feared that Ajax would not need a player with health problems, feared that the dream he carried from Nigeria would end before it truly began. So Kanu continued to live between two different worlds, one world where he was a young star attracting attention across Europe, and another world where every time his heart ached, it made him panic that something very terrible was happening inside his body. But at that time, he still did not know that the most frightening thing in his life was still ahead. After the Champions League title with AFC Ajax, the name Nwankwo Kanu began to appear on sports newspapers across Europe as the new symbol of African soccer. People called him a unique genius, the striker with the softest feet Nigeria had ever produced. Big clubs began to pursue him, and then in the summer of 1996, Kanu moved to Inter Milan amid the excitement of his entire home country Nigeria. It was not just a soccer transfer. For his family, for those who grew up with him amid the red dust in Owerri, it was like the moment a poor dream finally touched heaven. Inter Milan at that time was one of the biggest clubs in the world. Serie A was the toughest and most glamorous league on the planet, and Kanu believed his life was finally about to enter a completely new chapter. He thought he had defeated fate. He thought all the pain, loneliness, and poverty throughout his childhood had finally been rewarded. But then in just one day, everything collapsed. The medical checkup in Milan started like any other normal checkup. Kanu walked into the hospital with the confidence of a young player who had just conquered Europe. He did not know that just a few hours later, his entire life would change forever. The doctors began to talk to each other longer than usual when looking at his cardiovascular results. The atmosphere in the room gradually became tense. Worried looks appeared on their faces, making Kanu feel uneasy even though he did not yet understand what was happening. Then finally a doctor looked straight at him and said that his heart had a serious problem, aortic valve defect, risk of sudden death. He might never be able to play soccer again. He might die at any moment if he continued to play at high intensity. That moment felt like the whole world inside Kanu shattered. He could hardly hear what the doctor said after that. In his head there was only one sentence repeating, "I could die." He was just in his early 20s. He had just reached the door of his biggest dream, and now people were telling him that everything could end before it truly began. The days after that became the darkest time in Kanu's life. While newspapers across Europe wrote about the young African talent joining Inter Milan, he lay in the hospital with fear so great he could not sleep. There were nights he lay motionless looking up at the cold white ceiling, listening to the hospital machines beeping steadily, then wondering if he would still be alive to see the sun the next morning. For the first time in his life, soccer was no longer the most important thing. The only thing he thought about was death. He thought about his mother in Nigeria, thought about his younger siblings still waiting for him to send money home, thought about the whole family that had placed all their hopes on his feet, and then he burst into tears like a child in that strange hospital room. Kanu called Nigeria in despair. He tried to keep his voice calm so his mother would not panic, but inside he was completely broken. How could he tell his family that their son, seen as their greatest hope, could now die at any moment? How could he explain that all the dreams they had placed in him could disappear after just one medical checkup? There were times when Kanu felt betrayed by his own body. He had endured poverty, loneliness, and pressure for many years to get here. But when he finally stood in front of the door of the life he had always dreamed of, the heart inside his body wanted to take it all away. The chest pains he had once tried to ignore at Ajax now became a terrifying obsession. Every heartbeat made him afraid. Every time his heart beat stronger than usual, he thought he was about to die. There were nights he did not dare sleep deeply because he feared he would never wake up again. But the most painful thing was that the outside world had no idea what was happening. Fans saw a young star preparing to explode at Inter Milan. They saw a famous player full of potential and a bright future. Meanwhile, Kanu only saw the hospital, the doctors' worried faces, and death standing right in front of him. That was the first time he truly understood the feeling of loneliness to the point of despair. Because no one could feel the fear he carried in his chest. No one knew that behind the fame and the praising articles was a young man trembling because he feared his life would end too soon. And from that moment, the fear of death began to follow him for the rest of his life. Then the doctors made the final decision. If he wanted to live, Nwankwo Kanu had to have open-heart surgery as soon as possible. There were no other choices. No more time to avoid the truth. Just a few weeks earlier, he had been a young star sought after by all of Europe. Now he sat silently in the hospital, with the feeling that his entire future had just been torn apart right before his eyes. Inter Milan arranged for him to go to the United States for the major surgery. That flight was unlike any trip in Kanu's life before. When he left Nigeria for the Netherlands as a child, he carried hope. When he arrived in Italy, he carried the dream of becoming a world superstar. But this time he boarded the plane with the fear that he might never return. Throughout the long flight, Kanu barely slept. He looked out the airplane window in silence, his mind chaotic with thousands of terrifying thoughts. There were moments when he wondered if this was the end of his life. He was only in his early 20s. He had not yet had the chance to live the life he had fought for throughout his childhood. He had not yet helped his family completely escape hardship, had not yet become the person all of Nigeria expected. But now, all he could think about was the heart beating irregularly in his chest. The hospital in the United States was cold and quiet to the point of being frightening. The long white corridors, the smell of disinfectant, and the neon lights made Kanu feel like he was locked in a world without life. Nighttime was the most terrible time. When everything around sank into silence, the sound of the monitor beeping steadily beside the hospital bed became the only sound he heard. That beep-beep sound reminded him that his life was now measured by every heartbeat. There were nights when Kanu lay motionless looking up at the cold white ceiling, then burst into silent tears because he was so scared. He had never felt so lonely in his life. No stadium, no cheering, No soccer, only a young man trying to face the truth that he could die at any moment. And what pained him the most was the feeling that his life could end when he had not yet truly begun to live. Kanu began to pray more than ever. He prayed for his mother in Nigeria, for his younger siblings still waiting for him to return, for the dreams that had not yet become reality. Sometimes he closed his eyes and imagined the scene of his family receiving news that he did not survive the surgery. That thought nearly suffocated him. He feared his mother would collapse, feared how painful it would be for those who had placed their hopes in him if everything ended here. And then the night before the surgery, Kanu barely slept. He lay listening to the monitor beeping in the darkness, and for the first time truly faced death. There was no more way to run, no more soccer to forget the fear. Only him, his sick heart, and the surgery that could decide everything. The next morning, as he was wheeled into the operating room, Kanu felt his body shaking with panic. The bright white lights on the operating room ceiling, the sound of doctors talking to each other, and the freezing cold feeling in the air made him want to jump up and run away like a child. But he could not. When the anesthesia began to take effect, the last thing Kanu thought about was not soccer or fame. He thought about his family, thought about his mother, thought about the small house in Owerri where it all began, and then everything sank into darkness. The surgery was finally successful. The doctors saved his life, but even though his body survived, a part of Kanu's spirit seemed to have changed forever from that day. When he woke up after the surgery with the lingering pain across his chest, he understood that he would never be the same person again. From then on, fear began to cling to him like a shadow he could not escape. Every small chest pain made him panic. Every time his heart beat faster than usual made him think that death was coming back to finish what it had once left unfinished. There were nights later, even after he had returned to the field and been cheered by the whole world, when Kanu still woke up startled just to place his hand on his chest to check if his heart was still beating. People saw a survivor full of resilience, but inside him was a man who had never truly escaped that cold hospital room. The surgery had saved his life, but it had also taken away the sense of safety that a normal person naturally has. From that day, Kanu no longer lived only the life of a soccer player. He lived like a man who always carried within him the memory of how close death had once stood beside him. In the first days after the surgery, Nwankwo Kanu could hardly recognize his own body anymore. The man who once ran all over the soccer fields of Europe now had to relearn the simplest things like standing up, walking and breathing without feeling sharp pain in his chest. The long incision on his chest made every movement difficult. There were mornings when he sat for a long time on the edge of the bed, just to gather enough courage to stand up. His body had clearly weakened after the major surgery. The steps that had once been light on the grass now became slow and heavy as if he had aged decades in just a few months. But the most painful thing was not physical. The most painful thing was the feeling that he might never become himself again. While Kanu tried to recover little by little, the European media began to talk about him as a career that had ended. Many articles called him an unlucky talent. Some people in the soccer world believed that even if he survived, he would never have the strength to compete at the highest level again. At an age when other players were entering the most brilliant period of their careers, Kanu was seen as a man who had just escaped death and had no future. There were times when he read those articles in silence, then turned his face away because he could not bear the feeling of helplessness. He had fought throughout his childhood to escape poverty, endured loneliness in a foreign land, and survived the fear on the operating table. But now the whole world seemed to have decided that his story should end here. Nevertheless, Kanu still began training again. The first days stepping into the gym felt like torture. He had to walk slowly step by step on the treadmill, listening to his heartbeat with the constant fear that it could lose control at any moment. There were times while training when his heart suddenly beat hard, making him panic so much that he had to stop, slump down and try to breathe very slowly. In his mind, the image of the cold hospital room in the United States immediately appeared, the sound of the monitor beeping in the darkness, and the doctor's words that he could die at any moment. Those panic attacks began to appear more often, but Kanu did not tell anyone. He hid everything from his teammates, from the coaches, and even from his family. He feared that if people knew he was still afraid like that, they would lose faith in him. There were days when he stepped onto the training field with the familiar smile, talking normally as if nothing had happened, but inside he was trying to control the panic just because of a heartbeat faster than usual. Gradually, Kanu learned to live with the fear as part of his body. He started running again, even though every step came with a feeling of unease. There were training sessions when he had to stop many times because of chest tightness, but still forced himself to continue as if nothing was wrong. He understood that if he wanted to survive in top-level soccer, he had to make everyone believe he was fine, even when he himself did not truly believe it. And then what no one expected finally happened. Kanu returned to the field. When he played again, Nigeria almost went crazy with emotion. For millions of people in his homeland, Kanu was no longer just a soccer player, he became a symbol of a miracle, a man who had faced death but still returned to the field as if he had never fallen. The Nigerian people saw him as proof that God was still present in the lives of the poor. Children who had grown up in the red dust neighborhoods began to look at him as a living legend, but no one knew that every match with Kanu still felt like a terrifying psychological battle. Before stepping onto the field, he often quietly placed his hand on his chest as if to make sure his heart was okay. Every time he felt even slight tightness while playing, a freezing fear ran through his body. There were moments when he looked at the cheering crowd around him and wondered if he would collapse right in the middle of the field. But he still continued to run, continued to smile, continued to pretend he was fine. And from that moment, Kanu began to live like a man with no other choice but to hide his true fear from the whole world. Because he understood that if he let people see him weak, everything he had fought to keep could disappear once again. When Nwankwo Kanu joined Arsenal F.C. in the late 1990s, many people still did not really believe that his body could withstand top-level soccer again. But in London, under Arsene Wenger, Kanu gradually became one of the most beloved players in England. Arsenal fans loved him not only for the goals, they loved the way he always stepped onto the field with a gentle smile as if life had never hurt him. In a soccer world that was becoming increasingly tense and full of big egos, Kanu was like a person from somewhere else. He played soccer with a softness rarely seen in someone nearly 2 meters tall. His ball touches felt more like art than soccer. And what people remembered most about him was not strength or speed, but the strange calmness on his face every time he played. The audience saw a cheerful, relaxed, and improvisational man. They did not know that behind that smile was a heart that had nearly killed him. One of the most famous moments of Kanu's career came in the match against Chelsea F.C. in 1999. Arsenal was trailing and almost no one believed they could turn the situation around. But then Kanu stepped up as if he was playing soccer that only existed in imagination. He scored 3 unbelievable goals in a short time, completing the hat-trick that stunned all of England. The final goal, that improvised lob over the goalkeeper's head, became one of the most beautiful moments in Premier League history. Stamford Bridge fell silent while Arsenal fans went crazy. That night, the whole world saw a soccer genius smiling under the stadium lights, but no one saw what happened after the match. When the crowd left and the cheering disappeared, Kanu returned to his familiar reality: medicine, health checks, the silent questions in his head about whether his body could endure any longer. There were matches when he played so wonderfully that people thought he was enjoying soccer more than anyone else, but inside, Kanu always lived with a fear that never completely disappeared. Every slight tightness in his chest made him panic. Every time his heart beat faster than usual after a match reminded him of that cold hospital room in the United States many years earlier. There were nights before big matches when Kanu could hardly sleep. He lay looking at the hotel ceiling in the darkness, listening to his heartbeat echoing in his chest, then wondering if his body would collapse in the middle of a packed stadium. People often think soccer players fear failure, fear playing badly, or fear losing their place. But for Kanu, the greatest fear was always death. He had never completely believed that he was truly safe after the surgery, and therefore every time he stepped onto the field felt like a silent bet with his own body. But he did not let anyone see that. Teammates saw calmness, fans saw the smile, the press saw a fairy tale story about a player who overcame heart disease to return to the top. Only Kanu knew how afraid he was. There were days after playing when he sat silently for hours in the locker room just to let his body calm down. There were nights when he woke up startled by the feeling of his heart beating hard, then sat motionless in the darkness for a long time to make sure he was still alive. But the next morning he would appear in public again with the familiar smile as if nothing had happened. Gradually, Kanu was no longer just a soccer player. He became a symbol of resilience for millions of people. Poor children in Nigeria saw him as proof that someone born into hardship could still reach the top of the world. Heart patients saw him as evidence that life could continue after facing death. But the most heartbreaking thing was that this symbol was built on a fear that no one knew about. The more he was admired, the more Kanu felt he had to be stronger in public. He did not want people to see the real panic inside him. He did not want anyone to see the man who once lay trembling in the hospital because he feared he would not survive the night. So he continued to smile, continued to play soccer with the lightness that made the whole world love him, continued to become the hero everyone wanted to see. But deep inside, Kanu understood that he was living two different lives. One life as a field legend under bright lights, and another life in the darkness, where he was still the young man who once heard doctors say that his heart could stop beating at any moment. When Nwankwo Kanu's career grew brighter and brighter in Europe, his life also became a series of endless trips. Airplanes, hotels, stadiums, and unfamiliar cities followed one after another to the point that sometimes he himself no longer remembered where he was when he woke up in the morning. To the fans, that was the dream life of a famous soccer star. But for Kanu, those years were the loneliest time of his life. The most terrifying moments did not happen in front of tens of thousands of spectators in the stadium. They happened in the silent hotel rooms in the middle of the night, where there was no cheering, no teammates, and no one beside him to help if the worst happened. There were nights after Champions League or Premier League matches when Kanu returned to his hotel room in a state of complete exhaustion. Outside the window were the lights of cold European cities, while inside there was only the steady sound of the air conditioner and his heartbeat echoing in his chest. He often lay still for hours in the darkness, placing his hand on his chest just to feel whether his heart was still working normally or not. Every irregular beat made him panic. There were times when his heart beat faster after a tense match and Kanu immediately thought the nightmare from years ago was returning. He jumped up in the middle of the night, paced back and forth in the hotel room, and tried to breathe deeply to stop himself from sinking into panic. But what scared him the most was not only death. What scared him the most was the thought that he could die alone in a place with no family beside him, no mother, no relatives, no one who knew what was happening behind the door of that room. Only a famous player trying to stay calm while his mind was filled with the fear that his heart could stop beating at any moment. There were nights when Kanu did not dare to sleep. He feared that if he fell into too deep a sleep he would never wake up again. So he sat leaning against the headboard in the darkness, watching the clock tick minute by minute and waiting for dawn like a person who had just gone through a psychological war inside his own body. But the next morning, he still had to step down from the team bus with his teammates with a calm face as if nothing had happened. That was the most painful thing in Kanu's life. He was not allowed to let anyone see his real fear. Teammates saw a gentle, calm man who always smiled. The fans saw an artist on the field with soft feet and a rare, relaxed demeanor. No one knew that just a few hours earlier, he had been sitting in the hotel room trying to calm himself because he thought he was about to die. Kanu's fame grew bigger and bigger. He became a hero in Nigeria, beloved in London, and seen as a symbol of resilience around the world. But the more famous he became, the more lonely he felt, because he began to understand that fame could not cure the fear inside him. Money could not make him feel safer. Goals could not make his heart less terrifying. There were times after scoring and hearing the entire stadium chant his name that Kanu still felt a cold emptiness inside that nothing could fill. He once thought that if he succeeded, all the pain would disappear. But it was not like that. Poverty could stay behind, but fear did not. It followed him to every stadium, every flight, and every hotel room across Europe. There were nights when Kanu called Nigeria just to hear his family's voices before sleeping. He did not tell them how panicked he was. He did not tell them how afraid he felt every time he had chest pain. He only asked about everyone, tried to smile, and pretended everything was fine, because he did not want his mother to worry more. He did not want his family to think that the person carrying their hope was living in fear every day. Gradually, Kanu became so good at hiding his emotions that even he no longer knew which was the real person inside. In public, he was always gentle, calm, and full of resilience. But in the cold hotel rooms in the middle of the night, he was a lonely man fighting against the obsession with death that no one could see. And the longer he lived with it, the more Kanu understood a heartbreaking truth. Sometimes the scariest thing is not illness or death, but the feeling of having to silently endure it all alone while the whole world thinks you are happy.
At that, Nwankwo Kanu was no longer just a famous player.
After the Olympic miracle in 1996, he became the pride of all Nigeria, a symbol that millions of people saw as proof that Africa could also stand alongside the world's soccer powers. When the Nigeria national football team defeated Brazil and then Argentina to win Olympic gold in Atlanta, all of Nigeria exploded with emotion. People poured into the streets to celebrate all night. For a country used to living with instability, poverty, and disappointment, That victory was like a rare moment when they were allowed to forget the suffering. And at the center of that pride was Kanu. He became a national hero almost overnight. Poor children saw him as the image of their own future. Elders called him a gift that God sent to Nigeria. But at the same time, Kanu's life began to carry an enormous weight that no one saw. His success was no longer just his own. It became the spiritual asset of an entire country. Family, relatives, and the community began to depend on him more and more. His phone never stopped receiving pleas for help. A cousin needed money for medical treatment. An uncle needed help fixing his house. An old acquaintance wanted to borrow money to open a store. A child in the poor neighborhood needed school fees paid. Every time he returned to Nigeria, Kanu saw long lines of desperate people waiting in front of his house just to ask for his help, and he could almost never refuse anyone, because he understood too well what poverty felt like. He had once been the child watching adults in despair because they did not have enough money to live through the day. He had once slept in darkness because of power outages, and had seen his mother exhausted from the burden of the family. Therefore, every time he saw someone suffering, Kanu felt responsible for saving them. But the more he gave, the more exhausted he became. There were times when his money flowed out so fast that even those around him worried. But what tired Kanu the most was not the money. It was the pressure to always be strong in front of everyone. To Nigeria, he was not allowed to be weak, not allowed to be afraid, not allowed to fall. He was the African symbol, the living hero who survived heart disease, the hope of millions of people looking for a miracle in a harsh life. And so Kanu continued to smile, even as he grew more and more exhausted inside. There were days when he had just played in Europe and then stayed up all night solving financial problems for relatives back home. There were times when he was worried about his own irregular heartbeat, but still tried to help others as if he himself was completely fine. The most heartbreaking thing was that Kanu gradually began to feel he had to save everyone, even though he himself was in pain. He lived like a man who always had to carry the whole world on his shoulders. Every time Nigeria failed, he felt as if he had let the country down. Every time someone came asking for help, he felt guilty if he could not help them. And amid all that pressure, he still had to continue fighting the fear in his chest without being able to share it with anyone. There were nights after international matches when Kanu sat alone in his hotel room, looking out the window and feeling so tired that he no longer knew whether he was living for himself or for everyone else. But the next morning, he still stepped onto the field with the familiar smile, because he understood that millions of people needed to see that image to keep believing in hope. And gradually Kanu was no longer just a person of flesh and blood. He became the symbol that everyone wanted to lean on. But behind that symbol was still a lonely man trying to survive each day with the heart that had nearly taken his life. The most painful thing is that sometimes the strongest people are precisely those who are never allowed to say that they are very tired. Amid all the stadium lights, the long flights across Europe, and the enormous pressure from an entire country, perhaps the only thing that kept Nwankwo Kanu from completely collapsing was his family. When life outside became increasingly noisy and heavy, the small home he returned to after matches gradually became the only place where he felt he was still a normal person, rather than the symbol the whole world was looking at. Life with Amara Kanu gave Kanu something that fame and money had never been able to give him: the feeling of being able to breathe without having to pretend to be strong. Amara entered his life at a time when Kanu had become too used to hiding all his pain inside. The public saw a calm, gentle man full of resilience, but Amara saw something different. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes after every match. She saw the way he stayed silent for too long whenever he felt chest tightness. She saw the nights when he woke up startled and then sat motionless in the darkness as if trying to listen to his own body. Kanu had never been very good at talking about his fears. He grew up in a world where men had to endure in silence. But Amara understood that behind the gentle smile that millions loved was a man who had lived too long with the obsession of death. There were evenings after returning from the stadium when Kanu hardly said anything. He just sat quietly in the house, listening to the sound of the children running around the living room and trying to let himself feel that rare peace. Simple moments like having dinner with the family, hearing the children's laughter, or praying with his wife before bed gradually became what kept him from sinking completely. To others those might be ordinary things, but for Kanu, that was the only place where he did not need to play the role of hero. There were nights when the couple sat praying for a long time in silence after big matches, not to ask for more titles or money. They only prayed that his heart would continue to be stable for one more day. They only prayed that the next morning he would still wake up beside his family. And it was in those moments that Amara began to understand that soccer had taken more from Kanu than the public could imagine. People saw glory, but she saw exhaustion. People saw the smile, but she saw the fear he had tried to hide for many years. There were times when Kanu returned home after a match in a state of complete exhaustion, but still forced himself to smile so the children would not worry. There were nights when he unconsciously placed his hand on his chest, and then quietly left the bed just to walk around the house because he did not dare to sleep. And Amara understood that her husband had never truly escaped that hospital room in the United States years ago. The memory of death still lingered somewhere inside him like a shadow that refused to disappear. But the family also helped Kanu see life differently. When the children grew up, he began to realize that life could not revolve only around soccer, fame, or the fear of surviving one more day. There were rare afternoons when he was not playing, when he sat playing with the children for hours in the yard and felt a peaceful happiness that he had never had as a child. He watched them run and jump carefree, and sometimes wondered what his life would have been like if his own childhood had been that peaceful. Those moments gradually helped Kanu understand that beyond the pressure of soccer and the expectations of the whole world, he was still just a man who wanted to live many more years to see his children grow up. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he began to wish for something simpler than all the titles he had ever won, to be truly at peace. But the heartbreaking thing was that even in the most peaceful moments with his family, the fear inside him had never completely disappeared. It only became a little quieter each time he heard his children's laughter or felt Amara's hand holding his during those long sleepless nights. Perhaps it was precisely those years of living with the fear of losing his life that made Nwankwo Kanu unable to turn his back on people facing the same tragedy he had once experienced. After surviving open-heart surgery and returning to the field in what many saw as a miracle, Kanu began to carry a strange feeling inside that he could not escape. It was the feeling of survivor's guilt. He always wondered why he had been saved while so many others out there, especially poor children in Nigeria, did not even have the chance to step into a real hospital. And that very thought led him to the decision to establish the Kanu Heart Foundation. To many people it was a charity fund from a famous player, but for Kanu it was like his way of trying to repay the debt to life after being given a second chance to live. His trips back to Nigeria from then on were no longer just visits to family or appearances in the media. Kanu began going to poor hospitals, places where the smell of old disinfectant mixed with the despair of families who no longer knew what to hold on to. There were children's hospital wards so crowded that the hallways were packed with people. Mothers holding their children sat listlessly on old plastic chairs for days, just waiting for a tiny hope that someone would help them save their child. And every time he stepped into those places, Kanu saw himself from many years ago. He saw skinny children lying and breathing with difficulty in hospital beds, saw small chests trying to fight against unhealthy hearts, and a feeling of pain flooded inside him. There were children who looked at him with eyes full of both hope and fear that Kanu could never forget, because he understood that look too well. It was the look of a person who did not want to die but did not know if they would have the chance to be saved. What pained him the most was not only the illness, it was the helplessness of poor families. There were fathers who knelt in front of Kanu just to beg for money for their child's surgery. There were mothers who burst into tears because they knew that if no miracle happened, they would have to take their child home and wait for the worst. And every time that happened, Kanu could hardly stay calm. He remembered the feeling of lying in the hospital in the United States, listening to the monitor beeping in the middle of the night and waiting for the doctors to save his life. But unlike him back then, many children in Nigeria did not even have that chance. That was exactly what made Kanu pour nearly all his heart into the Heart Foundation. He helped sponsor surgery for many children with congenital heart disease, sent them abroad for treatment, and tried to save as many lives as possible. But what the public rarely saw were the moments when Kanu almost emotionally collapsed after successful surgeries. There were times when he stood silently in the hospital hallway after hearing the doctor say that a child had passed the danger, then turned away to wipe his tears because he could not hold back his emotions. People were used to seeing Kanu as a symbol of resilience, but in those moments, he was just a man who had once been very afraid of dying, now watching other children being given another chance to live. There were babies who, after recovering, ran to hug him without understanding that he himself was also trying to heal some part inside himself by saving them. Gradually, Kanu began to live with the feeling that he had to help others to be worthy of the second chance life had given him. He never forgot that he could have died when he was still very young, and perhaps that was why he no longer allowed himself to live only for himself. Every child saved was like a reminder that the pain he had gone through was not completely meaningless, but sometimes that also made his heart heavier, because the more children with heart disease he saw, the more he remembered the fear he had tried to bury deep for many years. There were nights after leaving the hospital when Kanu sat silently for a long time in the car without saying anything. He looked out at the dark roads in Nigeria and thought about how many children out there were still waiting to be saved. And in those moments he understood that the greatest battle of his life had never really been soccer. It was the battle between life and death, between hope and despair. And perhaps for the rest of his life he would continue to carry that battle inside him as an inseparable part of who he was. But one day, the cheering sounds gradually stayed behind. After many years living under stadium lights, long flights across Europe, and the pressure of top-level soccer, Nwankwo Kanu stepped into post-retirement life with a strange feeling he had never mentally prepared to face. For nearly his entire life, soccer had always forced everything inside him to stay silent. The matches, the training sessions, the sound of the crowd, and the packed schedule helped him not have too much time to truly sit down and face his fear. But when the stadium no longer called his name every weekend, the silence began to become more frightening than ever. There were no more cheers to pull him out of his own thoughts. There was no more adrenaline to make him forget the heart that had nearly killed him. All that remained was a body aging day by day and the painful memories returning more clearly than ever. Kanu began to feel age in a very different way from normal people. For him, every pain in his body carried the obsession that his heart might have a problem again. There were mornings when he woke up with a lingering fatigue and immediately remembered the days lying in the hospital in the United States. The regular heart checkups gradually became an experience that he both needed and feared. Every time he stepped into the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and the sound of the monitor pulled him back to the most terrifying time of his life. Even though he had survived many years after the surgery, some part inside Kanu had never truly believed he was completely safe. There were times when sitting waiting for the doctor to read the test results, he still felt his heart beating fast with panic like the young man back then at Inter Milan. The heartbreaking thing was that the fear did not disappear with time. It only became quieter, deeper, and more silent. When he was still playing, he could hide it behind matches and smiles. But after retirement, Kanu began to live with it in the long quiet of old age. He gradually became more reserved with the media. He no longer liked appearing too much in front of crowds. He no longer wanted to live in the noise of fame like before. People saw him as calmer and more peaceful, but few understood that it was also his way of trying to keep his mind stable. There were afternoons when he sat alone for a very long time in the yard, quietly watching his children grow up, and thinking about the life that had passed. He began to spend most of his time with family, with faith, and with charity work instead of soccer. The prayers now were no longer to ask for victories or titles. He only prayed for more time, more peaceful years with his family, more opportunities to continue watching his children grow up. But the very silence of old age sometimes made the painful memories return more clearly than ever. There were nights when Kanu lay awake in the darkness and remembered the cold hospital room in the United States, as if everything had only happened yesterday. He still remembered the sound of the monitor beeping steadily in the middle of the night. He still remembered the fear before the surgery. He still remembered the times when he thought he might never see his mother and family again. There were memories that had seemed to sleep for many years that suddenly returned just from a slight chest pain or an abnormally fast heartbeat. And in moments like that, Kanu realized that sometimes the greatest battles in life never truly end. They only retreat deeper inside a person. But even while carrying all those fears, he still continued to live slowly and quietly, like a man trying to learn how to be grateful for every day he was still present in this world. Perhaps after everything he had been through, the only thing Kanu truly wanted was no longer glory or fame. He just wanted to be at peace. He wanted to live long enough to continue loving his family, to continue helping children with heart disease, and to continue proving that a man who had once stood very close to death could still find light in the rest of his life. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing in Nwankwo Kanu's entire life was not the heart disease, not the surgeries or the sleepless nights because of fear. The most heartbreaking thing was that he had to live too long in silence without daring to let the whole world know how truly afraid he was. When looking back at his entire life journey, Kanu understood that most of his adult life had been built on two things: pressure and fear. The pressure to succeed in order to save his family from poverty, the pressure to become a symbol for Nigeria and Africa, the pressure to always be strong because millions of people were looking at him as a source of hope. And parallel to all of that was the silent fear that had never truly disappeared since the day the doctors said his heart could stop beating at any moment. There were matches when Kanu stepped onto the field in a state of panic but no one noticed. There were days when he felt tightness in his chest before kickoff and thought he might collapse right in the middle of the stadium. But then the sound of the crowd rose. The cameras turned toward him, and Kanu put on the familiar smile as if everything was completely fine. Fans saw a legend who was calm amid the enormous pressure of top-level soccer. They did not know that sometimes that man had just gone through an entire war inside his head just to have enough courage to step onto the field. There were nights in the hotel when Kanu was almost certain he was about to die. He sat in the darkness, placed his hand on his chest, and waited for the next heartbeat like a person counting down the remaining time of his life. But the next morning, he still put on the jersey, stepped out in front of tens of thousands of spectators, and played soccer with a lightness that made the whole world believe he had never known suffering. That was the life Kanu had lived for many years, a public life full of victories, titles, and cheers that was completely opposite to the nights of panic and solitude that no one saw. People remember him as the Champions League champion with AFC Ajax, the Olympic hero of the Nigeria national football team, and the legend of Arsenal F.C. But very few people know that there were times when Kanu stepped onto the field with the feeling that he might never see his family again. What exhausted him the most was not playing, but having to always pretend that he was strong. For many years, Kanu almost never allowed himself to be weak in front of anyone. He did not want his family to worry. He did not want his teammates to lose faith. He did not want the people of Nigeria to see their symbol trembling before death. So he learned to hide everything behind the gentle smile that had become a familiar image to the whole world. Gradually he hid it so well that even those closest to him could not fully understand what was happening inside him. But having to live like that for many years made Kanu feel more and more lonely. Because sometimes the scariest thing is not the illness but the feeling of not being able to tell anyone the truth about his pain. There were times when he felt like he was living two completely different lives. One life as a field legend loved by millions, and another life as a man who always carried the obsession that his heart could betray him at any moment. The more famous he became, the more he felt he was not allowed to fall, because to too many people Kanu was no longer a normal person. He was a symbol of hope, of miracles, and of survival. But behind all of that was still a man who had once trembled in the hospital because he feared he would not survive the night. And perhaps what makes Kanu's story even more painful is that he had never completely defeated that fear. He only learned how to live with it, learned how to keep going even though his heart was still full of unease, learned how to smile even though many nights he still woke up startled by the feeling of an irregular heartbeat. People often think legends are people who do not know fear. But the truth about Kanu is completely different. He did not become a legend because he was not afraid. He became a legend because he lived nearly his entire life in fear and still continued to stand up every day. And perhaps that is what makes millions of people around the world truly respect him. Not the titles, not the goals, but the fact that the man the whole world admires had carried the greatest silent fear inside for many decades, yet never let it stop him from continuing to live, continuing to love, and continuing to become hope for others. And then when looking back at Nwankwo Kanu's entire life, people finally understand that his story had never been just about soccer. It is the story of a boy born amid the red dust and poverty in Nigeria, growing up in a house that was always lacking, but still carrying a dream big enough to overcome everything fate tried to put on his shoulders. It is the story of a child who once played barefoot soccer on the scorching hot ground in Owerri, who once heard the sound of his whole family's hungry stomachs on dark nights without electricity, who once saw his mother exhausted from trying to raise her children in a country full of instability. And it was that very boy who later became one of the greatest legends in the history of African soccer. Kanu's life was like something unimaginable to many Nigerians of his generation. From the poor neighborhoods of Owerri, he stepped out into the world, conquered Europe with AFC Ajax, lifted the prestigious UEFA Champions League trophy, won Olympic gold with the Nigeria national football team, and became a beloved legend at Arsenal F.C. He won the Premier League, the FA Cup, became a member of England's most famous unbeaten team, and was respected by the whole world for his rare gentleness in a sport full of collisions and pressure. But what no one truly saw was that behind all those titles there always existed a silent pain that lasted for many decades. While fans cheered at his moments of genius on the field, Kanu lived with the fear that his heart could stop beating at any moment. While the world saw a legend who always smiled, he went through countless sleepless nights in hotel rooms, placing his hand on his chest just to make sure he was still alive. Perhaps that was the most painful part of Kanu's life. He had to live two completely different lives. One life in public, where he was the national hero, the symbol of Africa, the hope of millions of people, and the image of extraordinary resilience. And another life in private, where he was a man who always lived with the obsession of death since the day he heard the doctor say that his heart could betray him at any moment. But what makes Kanu's story go far beyond soccer lies in the fact that he never let the pain turn him into a bitter person. He did not use his fame to live selfishly or forget where he came from. After everything he had been through, he still continued to return to help others, as if the heart that had nearly killed him was also what made him love people more. The children saved thanks to the Kanu Heart Foundation are the clearest proof of that. Kanu saw himself in those children with heart disease. He understood the feeling of lying in a hospital bed and not knowing if he would continue to live. He understood the despair of families who did not have enough money to save their children. And that was why he devoted most of the rest of his life to trying to give others the chance to live that he had been lucky enough to receive. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about Kanu is not in the trophies or goals. It lies in the fact that a person who had lived too long in fear still chose to continue loving life instead of resenting it. Many people become cold after suffering, but Kanu was different. He remained gentle, he remained kind, he still smiled at everyone the same way he did when he was a poor boy in Nigeria. And perhaps that is exactly what made millions of people truly love him for so many years. Now, when the stadium lights have faded into the distance and the cheering no longer rings out every weekend, Kanu lives much more quietly. He spends time with his family, with faith, and with charity work. There are no more big matches. There is no more pressure to prove anything to the world. There is only a man who has gone through so much pain and finally learned how to be grateful because he is still here. There are quiet afternoons when he sits watching his children grow up and perhaps understands more clearly than anyone else that everything could have ended a very long time ago. He should not have been able to see those peaceful moments. The weak heart from back then should have taken everything away. But somehow, he survived. Not only survived to become a soccer legend, but also survived to become a symbol of hope for so many others. And perhaps after all, the greatest thing Nwankwo Kanu left behind is not the titles in a museum or the goals on old footage. His true legacy lies in the fact that he proved a person can carry the greatest fear throughout an entire life and still continue to love, continue to help others, and continue to walk with rare kindness. In the eyes of the world, Kanu will forever be the African soccer legend with the gentle smile and moments of genius on the field. But perhaps only those who truly understand his story know that behind that smile was once a man who lived with death in his chest for many years. And it is precisely the fact that he continued to stand firm after everything that once wanted to knock him down that is the greatest victory of his life. Kanu's story is painful in that he not only fought against poverty or soccer pressure, but also had to live nearly his entire life in fear without being allowed to let anyone see it. The image of the skinny boy playing barefoot soccer amid the red dust of Nigeria, then later becoming a legend of Arsenal F.C. and the Olympic hero of 1996, is a journey that touches people not only because of the success, but because of the enormous mental price he had to pay. The most heartbreaking thing is precisely the very small details in the story. The nights he sat in the hotel room placing his hand on his chest, just to make sure his heart was still beating, the times he panicked after matches, but the next morning still had to step onto the field with a gentle smile, so the whole world would believe he was fine. That is the very real tragedy of many people in modern society, especially in the United States, where millions are living under the pressure to always be strong, successful, and positive, even though inside they are full of anxiety, loneliness, and mental exhaustion. Kanu's story also shows that fame and money cannot heal the fear inside a person. Even though he became a world soccer legend, he still carried a feeling of loneliness every night because of the obsession with death. But what makes him worthy of respect more than anything is that after surviving, he did not become bitter, but used his own pain to save children with heart disease through the Kanu Heart Foundation. That is a very big lesson for American society today. The true value of a person does not lie in how famous or rich they are, but in how they treat others after they themselves have gone through suffering. Kanu did not win because he was not afraid. He won because even though he was afraid for many years, he still continued to live with kindness, love his family, and never stop bringing hope to others. If Nwankwo Kanu's story has touched your heart, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a token of gratitude for the man who lived for many years in fear but still chose to become hope for millions of others. Thank you for staying until the end of this painful but extraordinary journey, and see you again in the next video with another story about people who seem invincible but have also silently endured wounds that no one sees.